Hi everyone, it's Blake from ChessPathways.com. We're doing another game analysis video today from one of our Chess Pathways members. This time we have a miniature from the Sicilian defense. So let's go ahead and get right to it. The player here who had the white pieces, named Raymond, went wrong very quickly in this game. He wanted my help figuring out what went wrong and what he can learn from this game. So let's see the game here. Started with e4, c5, and now this move c4. And by the way, I did get to see the players' comments. They're not in front of me here on the board because of the format I received this in. But Raymond, I did read through your comments, so I kind of have a feel for how you were thinking throughout the game. You didn't give much commentary on the opening, though, so I'm wondering how familiar you might be with some of these Sicilian positions or how much thought you were putting into the moves here. So c4 looks like a move that follows the opening principles. It does gain space, and this is an idea in some Sicilian lines to just clamp down on the d5 square, make it really hard for black to ever play d5. But in the game, I noticed it made it hard for you to get your own pawn breaks of your own. Let's just go forward a couple moves just to see what happened here in the opening. So it looks like you're following opening principles here, right? You're developing your pieces, you get castled. But the problem here is you really don't have a good plan in this position. In a sense, you've obeyed the three major opening principles perfectly, right? You're controlling space in the center, you've started developing your pieces, and you've gotten castled. You've done all three things, and you're about to develop your bishop too. So you're following those principles great, but there's a couple minor ones you broke. For example, it's usually wrong to play the bishop in front of the central pawn. These central pawns are usually really key to control space in the middle, and you don't want to block them in with your bishop like this, usually. And you also committed to this structure really early with the pawns on e4 and c4, as early as move 2 even, which allows black to have this outpost on the d4 square, and you were never able to get this d4 break in. So if we scroll forward a little bit here and look at what happened in the game, now it's going to be almost impossible to ever play the move pawn to d4. And we're left with this position with a really locked center, right? Black's probably not going to be able to play d5 anytime soon. You're not going to be able to play d4 anytime soon. So often what happens when the center is locked like this is play kind of becomes all about the flanks and whose pawn breaks are going to be more effective. So let's go forward just a little bit more. So black has plans here to possibly play for b5 at some point, or to play for f5 on the king side. And your pawn breaks here are going to be b4 and f4 too, because that's really the only way to make progress in the position. The position's too locked for this position to just be all about piece play, right? You know, the pawns need to be leveraged here to get the rooks into the game and to finish development. And play in the center is just about impossible right now. So it's going to be about these pawn breaks and who can use them more effectively. So I guess just before we go any further, just some general advice about the opening. I would just choose a more common setup against the Sicilian. There's all kinds, out there these days. You can play the closed Sicilian with like f4 and fianchettoing on the king side, and then you have a clear plan, right? You can keep expanding on the king side and play on the king side. You can just open the center up. You can play knight f3 and d4. If you don't like how sharp those lines get, you can always play c3 with the idea to play d4. You can even play this c4 line and just maybe play d4 before, you kind of lose the opportunity to. Although it's kind of hard to see exactly how, because black gets tempo on your pawn. Probably not bishop d3 here. Can we play knight c3 and then d4 next turn? I don't think black can stop us. Right, we could play a position like this. That would be preferable, I think, to what happened in the game as well. So there's all kinds of things we can do here, but I think just allowing this completely locked center, it's not the end of the world, but I think it makes it very hard to play this position for white. So let's keep going. You play b3, knight c6, bishop to b2. So you've developed a piece, but what does this bishop really do on b2, right? It's not really accomplishing anything here. This e5 pawn is super solid, and I think, if I'm remembering correctly, for the rest of the game it just sat here doing nothing, right? So it seems like you understand the opening principles, which is great. That's really important to understand. But in these kind of positions, with the locked center, all 8 pawns still on the board for both players, it really becomes more about the pawn breaks and the long-term planning more than just rapidly developing your pieces. That's taught, kind of as a common guideline to beginners, because a lot of times, in games especially between beginners, they're playing, common e4, e5 openings, early pawn breaks. The center's going to open fast, and the activity of the pieces is going to determine who has the advantage in a lot of cases. In this position, you can't just develop a piece and say, hey, it's developed. You really have to consider the long-term implications, and it becomes a lot more strategic and long-term planning in nature. So bishop g4, black goes ahead and pins that knight, and you're always going to have to watch out for knight to d4. You play h3 to put the question to that bishop, and black maintains that pin, probably correctly so. And yeah, here you played queen e2. I guess you didn't really see this knight to d4 idea, which I think comes down to just always asking, like I always recommend, if I make this move, what's my opponent going to do? And I think knight d4 is a move you would be able to find here. It does kind of stand out as an obvious idea for black. So what I would probably do here after bishop h5, probably just put the bishop back on e2, because it doesn't really do anything on d3 except get in the way. And then you can play d3 later. I mean, the pawn has to go here eventually, right? It supports your center. It's not going to d4, so you might as well put it on d3. And you just kind of play from there. Maybe this knight can swing around to the king side at some point. Maybe you start organizing a pawn break one way or the other. After some careful preparation, of course. The game's going to kind of develop slowly from here, but I think both sides are probably fine. Anyway, after knight d4, your pawn structure is going to get wrecked, unfortunately. So queen e3, black goes ahead and takes that knight on f3, and you're left with doubled pawns. Which isn't always the end of the world, actually. Especially in these positions with, all 8 pawns left on the board. People often forget one of the advantages of doubled pawns is it opens a file for you. Right now you have the semi-open g file. Black doesn't have any semi-open files. So, I mean, at least you have a spot to put your rook, right? A rook's probably coming to g1. But the problem is, with you being castled on this side, I think it's just really easy for black to get play over here. This knight can probably come to f4 at some point, especially because this bishop is quite a few moves away from regaining control of that square. Followed by maybe pawn to f5. Black's going to get that pawn break in. And black just has the more comfortable game now, for sure, with the exposed white king. Queen d7, just attacking your h3 pawn. You go ahead and defend it. Bishop g6. And here you played knight d5, and yeah, you correctly pointed out that f4 might have been a good chance here to kind of turn the tables a little bit. Again, all about those pawn breaks. Just, fighting for control of the center. If black doesn't take that pawn, you can go ahead and push to f5 in some lines. Just gets a pawn involved in the action. So knight d5 takes, and you took with the c-pawn. You didn't give any comment here about your consideration of which pawn to recapture with. You just mostly said you wanted to exchange off some of black's attacking pieces because you were scared about the safety of your king. So you took with the c-pawn, I guess, without much consideration. E takes looks interesting, capturing with the e-pawn just to try to trade off more attacking pieces. I think the concern here, though, is that f5 is probably going to be played. Although if black plays f5, now I think our f4 idea looks actually good again. We're kind of fixing this pawn on f5 and shutting a lot of the black pieces out of the attack. So I don't know if black wants to do that right away. So if not f5 right away, what if black exchanges here on d3? Yeah, it still looks pretty unpleasant for us. Black's probably going to play something like bishop to g5 and just cement this bishop on the outpost here. On f4, the queen can swing around to the king side. Black can either play f5 or somehow get the pawns and the rooks involved. And white really is lacking counterplay here, I think, is the big problem. So you chose to take with the c-pawn, which makes sense. I mean, now if black plays f5, some exchanges are going to have to occur. And if black doesn't play f5, how is black really going to make progress here on the king side, I guess is the question. I noticed in your commentary you were pretty pessimistic at this point. You said your position's horrible, your king's exposed. It sounded like you thought you were just going to be mated. I don't think it's really that simple. I guess black has the idea to... I guess one idea I'm seeing is to play like h6, and then play your bishop to g5 and f4, and then, bring the queen to the g-file. But it's not that easy, because you can always put a rook on the g-file. I guess if they kick your king away from h2, then they could go after the h3 pawn, maybe with the bishop's help. Yeah, black definitely has some ideas, but you're not without ideas of your own. I mean, you're going to put a rook on the g-file. Hopefully this bishop can make itself useful in time, right? It's going to take a while, unfortunately, because of, how awkward your development was. But if you can play your pawn out of the way to d3 and bring your bishop back to c1, hopefully it can help out on the king side. And I think, white has a chance to survive here. Castle, you do put the rook on g1. Black plays f5. And you said you considered here whether to take that pawn or not. Both options actually look kind of dangerous the more I'm looking at this. Yeah, this is pretty good for black, because if we don't take this pawn, if we just say, play rook g2 or something, then I think after f4, I think the big problem here is that our bishop is just never going to get into the game, right? What can this bishop do, ever? Right? It can't help out on the king side anymore. Black's going to be able to slowly build up on the king side, probably with some rook lifts, with some, threats to the h3 pawn, at key moments. And white just has no counterplay here. I think letting black play f4 is just really unpleasant. So my first instinct when I saw this whole position kind of developing is that if black ever played f5, we would just take and try to, make some exchanges. But it's not so easy either after seeing what happened in the game. So bishop takes f5. Yeah, they're threatening your pawn on h3. In the game you played rook g3, but then bishop h4 looks really unpleasant. And I was actually curious in the game. You took on f5, and they just took back on f5? I just want to make sure. Couldn't they throw in this in-between move with check? Just win the exchange right now? And no matter how you take back, they take back on f5, and they're just up a solid exchange. I mean, they won the exchange anyway. I guess they know you can't move your rook away from g3. In the game after rook g3, bishop h4, bishop takes f5. They just took back. And I guess you have trouble here moving your rook away anyways, because the f3 pawn's hanging. Yeah, okay, this is lost for white, for sure. I'm just trying to double check if maybe you had any better option here. So after f5, he takes f5, bishop takes f5. What if we exchange on f5, just to remove the threat to the h3 pawn? I mean, it's still not pleasant, right? f3 is under attack. We can defend for now with rook g3, but I think black's just going to simply double on the, well, really triple on the f-file at this point with the queen and the two rooks. And our d-pawns are weak and isolated. We have doubled isolated f-pawns, double isolated d-pawns, a weak king. This is definitely lost for white. I'll just play through the final few moves of the game just for completeness. So bishop h4, you take on f5, they take back. Queen e4, you lose the exchange. Queens get traded, and black doubles rooks. And you decided to resign here. Which, I'm not sure the ratings of these players. Just from seeing the game, I would guess that this is probably a game, who knows, maybe in the 1,000 to 1,400 range, somewhere in there. Resigning is reasonable here. White is definitely completely lost, right? You mentioned in your commentary, you're down the exchange, you have some weak pawns, black has no weaknesses at all, black's doubled on the f-file. I guess my question to you would be, if you were black in this position, would you be confident you could win this position, 100% of the time? Because there's a lot of players that's not true of. They know a position's completely winning, but could they really win it 100% of the time? And if you can't, then playing through the rest of the game is still going to be instructive to you. You're going to try to, cause your opponent problems, see how they handle those problems. So I would only recommend resigning if you were confident you could win this position if you were black 100% of the time. But that might be true. I mean, this isn't a very difficult win for black. It's pretty hard to go wrong. So, okay, thank you for sharing that game with us. I guess some big takeaways here are, number one, in those really locked up positions out of the opening, both sides still have 8 pawns on the board, there's no real possible central pawn breaks, it becomes a lot less important, how many tempos am I ahead in development, how many pieces am I developed, how close am I to getting castled, and the long-term planning becomes a lot more important. There's not going to be a whole lot of short-term tactics, but setting yourself up for that long-term success kind of outweighs that when the position is so locked up. So that's something to think about if you want to play these openings where the center gets locked down like that. The second lesson, and again, it's come up time and time again, before you make any move, you always want to ask, what's my opponent going to do if I make this move, right? Back here when you miss knight d4, again, I'm sure you're a good enough player you can see a move like knight d4, right? That's black's most obvious idea here. They have the pin on the knight. I know you could find knight d4 if you would ask, if I play this move, if I play queen e2, what's my opponent going to do? Right? And then you would have seen knight d4, and that was kind of the cause of at least the start of the cause of all your problems there on the king side. Getting those doubled pawns after knight d4. So very important, always ask, what's my opponent going to do if I make this move? And then I guess the final lesson from this game is, we're all going to get bad positions sometimes, right? No matter how good you are at chess, you're sometimes going to get a bad position. And when we do, it's important not to be pessimistic. From seeing your comments, it looked like you were really pessimistic here. When you get these bad positions, it's important to take your time every turn and just look for those resources that could turn things around. I think this was one of the key moments here when you could have played f4 and the threat of possibly playing f5, or if black takes this pawn, now your pawns are undoubled and you can even try to play in the center possibly. You have ideas to play f4 later and e5 or f5, put this rook on an e-file, now your bishop has an open diagonal. This would massively turn things around. And again, if black doesn't take there, you're playing f5. Just, being vigilant on every turn and looking for those opportunities to turn the game around is going to let you, wiggle out of some pretty tough spots throughout the course of your chess career. Thank you everyone for watching. As always, if you want your chess games analyzed, if you want access to exclusive content and contests, and a community that has each other's backs, please check out chesspathways.com. Right now you'll get a free guide to chess thinking when you sign up. You'll get notifications about our new content that's going out. It's completely free to join, so please do that right now. And I will see you again soon. Thanks.